Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
The story of the UK is an economy that has got real momentum.
What is broken can be repaired. What is ruined can be rebuilt.
UK inflation is becoming much more homegrown.
We have huge potential as an economy in the UK.
This is a time to tell Israel there is a path to peace.
Our plan for the British economy is working, but the work is not done.
You're listening to Bloomberg UK Politics. I'm Yuan Potts.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. Welcome to the programme and welcome back to you, Yuan. Very nice to have you back with us after your few months away in the sun, working elsewhere for Bloomberg in the past few months. Let's see, what did you miss? So we have the Tories talking about tax cuts, announcing a few in the budget. We have Labour leading in opinion polls. We are a month away from local elections, so that's getting a little bit closer as well. But does feel like perhaps not that much change. Although we have a new slogan.
Cost of chaos.
Yes.
And a new website, a new microsite from the Labour Party. Yeah, quite glossy looking. Expect more of these as time goes on. We're not very many months away from an election. I think this sort of thing is going to become much more prevalent. You only see its Labour Party website at the bottom of it, actually. Some of the maths, though, a little bit questionable, I would say. Half of the £8 billion cost of chaos is Labour's calculation of how much mortgage refinancing will cost homeowners over the next 12 months. Because they tie it back to the disastrous Liz Truss mini-budget. But of course, interest rates are rising all around the world. So I think in reality, it doesn't have a lot to do with Liz Truss's premiership.
Sounds like a rebranding of Tory mortgage penalty, a favourite of Prime Minister's questions bingo.
That one's out of the window. Yeah, and a £34 million office revamp at the Department for Education, blaming that on frequent ministerial reshuffles. I mean, whatever the wrongs and rights of redoing the Department for Education offices, I think sort of trying to tie it to reshuffles is a little bit iffy. So some of this stuff I think is slightly questionable, but interesting that they're still going with this line of chaos and the costs of chaos. Yeah, it's an interesting sight from Labour.
Yeah, but kind of does draw together on what we have been hearing, especially if you're a regular listener to our Wednesday Prime Minister's Questions programme, of what we've been hearing from Keir Starmer. It's the sort of regular attack lines that we're used to seeing. I mean, it's almost as if we were to get a back to square one website from the Tories, which would be I think the equivalent at this stage of it. I'm interested to see how much these narratives evolve as we get closer to the election. I think, okay, they've both picked a clear line as to how they're going to, both parties, I mean, how they're going to plan to fight the election and the sort of the kind of key discussions we might expect or points of difference. But will this be followed up by a whole series of other perhaps policies that we might want to see coming closer to an election as well?
Policies, goodness. I think laying out policies is a losing cause for an opposition, really, isn't it? We've seen that the Tories pinching a lot of Labour policy, particularly in the budget. All sorts of Labour-ish and Labour ideas were pinched by Jeremy Hunt. So I think it's really not in the opposition's interest to be laying things out at this stage. But hopefully we'll get some before the election comes. But
what will the cost of those be, is what I want to know, Yuan.
Yeah, indeed. Well, the price tags will presumably come as well. But yeah, I think it's interesting that Labour is using this theme of disorganisation, this chaos, as they like to put it, from the Conservatives, and attempting to say it's costing taxpayers a lot of money. So that's clearly Labour's focus at the moment.
To another story now. Shareholders last week refused to inject £500 million of equity into Thames Water, calling it uninvestable. That puts the UK's largest water company into crisis talks with the government this week. The words temporary nationalisation have even been put on the table, a nightmare scenario for a Conservative government. Joining us now with more details is Bloomberg reporter Jess Shankleman. Jess, just remind us, because this is a long-running saga with Thames Water, how did the company end up in this position?
Well, the answer is debt. Thames is the most heavily indebted of all of the water companies in England and Wales. So it desperately needs about £2.5 billion to deliver on its turnaround plan over the next 2 years, and then also to deliver on its business plan over the next 5 years after that to 2030, which involves tackling chronic sewage spills, leaks, poor customer service. Thames is one of the worst, probably the worst performing water company. The only way it is going to get that money is through equity. It cannot raise any more debt because its gearing is too high. That's the ratio of debt to equity. And the only place that equity is going to come from at the moment is its shareholders. Its shareholders are nine different shareholders. They're all, some of them Abu Dhabi Sovereign Wealth Fund, University Superannuation Scheme, there's a
and they're just
Canadian
not willing to step
pension
up the cash,
fund.
essentially.
They are saying the regulation from Ofwat, the watchdog, makes it impossible for them to invest. The shareholders are saying that the return on capital is such that it is cheaper and less risky to raise debt than it is to raise equity, and nobody is going to put equity in with the regulations that Ofwat are setting. Ofwat are saying Thames Water has been financially engineered to such a... this is what we're hearing Ofwat are saying, that Thames Water have been financially engineered in such a way that it has made it perform poorly financially, environmentally, and they cannot give any leeway. Thames is asking for leeway in the rules around the weighted cost of capital, around its ability to pay dividends, and Ofwat are saying we cannot give you any leeway.
But financial engineering being a coded way of saying just they've just got too much debt, as you say. Yeah. This is potentially a ticking fiscal time bomb for a government, isn't it? What's the danger of this thing exploding in exploding the government's finances or the next government's finances?
So whoever is the next owner of Thames Water, because we know that Carroll, the parent company of Thames, has talking to its creditors, they're saying they're not going to be able to repay this loan that's due at the end of April. You could buy Thames Water for £1, but you would still need to put in £3 billion to finance this turnaround plan. And if it's the government, they're going to have to put in that money, which they would probably rather be spending on, well, they would definitely be rather spending on other things rather than bailing out the UK's largest water company. So the question is, as you say, is this going to be a problem for this government or the next government? With an election looming, Rishi Sunak probably doesn't want it on his plate right now, but it very much is. And the government could press the button, could try to press the button, apply to the High Court and bring Thames into special administration, or it could try to drag things out and leave it until next year. Thames' CEO was saying on Thursday that they have enough cash, £2.4 billion, to get them through the next 15 months. But is that, is it a politically appealing situation to have a water company, the UK's biggest water and sewage company, with no owner, burning through cash for the next 15 months? Plus, they're being taken to court by the Environment Agency and Ofwat. They're facing potentially huge fines for sewage spills, and we don't know how those fines might factor in to that 15 months horizon that they've given us. So it might have to come sooner than Rishi Sunak would like.
Because, of course, the other element of it, and you've alluded to it there, is that the company actually has quite a lot of problems to fix in its regular piping as opposed to its financial piping.
Yes, Thames Water has problems to fix everywhere. I have colleagues regularly coming up to me complaining about their own personal dealings with Thames Water.
Just the privilege of covering water companies.
I know. And, and I kind of say to them, well, I would like to cover this, but there's actually the company itself appears to be on the brink of special administration. So it feels like everything is going wrong. The government has set really strict targets and they're pushing water companies on tackling sewage spills. It's been a huge issue in the UK for, since the pandemic, really, when people started doing a lot more open water swimming. And Thames Water hasn't been able to step up and offer more money where other water companies have said, OK, we're going to put in more money to show the government, appease the government that we're doing more on sewage. Thames doesn't have the cash. It doesn't have any money to do this. And it's not going to be able to fix the leaky pipes. It's not going to be able to fix the sewage spills. It means that people are going to be having raw sewage bubbling up in their kitchens.
Which is not only a nightmare scenario for those people affected by it, but you can be pretty sure they're going to want to blame the government very quickly if that becomes the case. What's the next big deadline in the story that we have to watch out for?
30th of April is a big deadline. This is when Carroll, the parent company of Thames, is due to pay a £190 million loan to its creditors. It's a small amount of money, but it happens to be the next big point at which we're going to see whether they are able to amend and extend this loan. We have been thinking that they would be able to, but on Thursday they said that they were going to be talking to their creditors, and it's now looking like they're just not going to pay that loan, which could then become the tipping point, and we could see Carroll default on its loans, which could see it go bust, and Thames would then be owned by the Carroll creditors. and we don't know who they are.
And that could make life even more complex than it
Nobody knows
already
who
is.
they are, so
Indeed.
it's extremely complex.
Okay, Jess Shankleman, thank you so much for bringing us up to date with the complexity of that story, but also pointing us in the direction of what we need to watch out for next, as of course we know that the government is going to be monitoring this situation very closely with Thames Water as well.
Next to a brewing political row over Scotland's new hate crime law, which came into force yesterday. The legislation creates a new crime of stirring up hatred relating to age, disability, religion, sexual orientation, transgender identity or being intersex. It adds more protected characteristics and lowers the bar for the offence compared to existing laws and to the laws in force elsewhere in the UK.
Now, the Harry Potter author JK Rowling, who's been a fierce critic of the Scottish Government's stance on transgender rights, is among those who's hit out at the legislation, challenging police to arrest her for some of her comments, while the Prime Minister appeared to support her position, saying the Conservatives will always protect free speech. To discuss, we're joined now by the human rights campaigner Peter Tatchell. Peter, great to have you with us on the programme. What is your view on this new law in Scotland? Does it add to protections against hate speech?
Well, Rishi Sunak and JK Rowling are exaggerating the potential threat to free speech of this new hate crime legislation. I do have some concerns, but what they are saying is an exaggeration. The aim of the legislation is to protect people against hate crime. That's a good thing. We want to protect people against the harm that hate crime causes. Two of the issues are, firstly, that the legislation does not include two groups that are often subjected to hate, namely women and travelling communities. And secondly, the language of the legislation, words like hate, malice, ill will, are not defined. They're open to subjective interpretation. So what some people may think is a reasonable view, others may determine to be hate. Now, the legislation does have some freedom of speech protections. It does say that merely discussing or criticising is not an offence under the legislation. It also says that under the European Convention on Human Rights, which applies in Scotland, it is also lawful to offend, shock or disturb. So there are those safeguards, but on the other hand, there's also the problem that the legislation allows third-party reporting. So you don't have to be a victim of hate yourself. Anyone can report it. Moreover, through Crime Stoppers, you can report it anonymously. So the fear is that this will lead to vexatious, malicious campaigns to target particular people and to report them for hate speech, for hate crimes. And that could completely overwhelm the police and put them in a very, very difficult position.
Are you worried about the amount of discretion that this gives to the police? It does seem that quite a lot of this has been quite vaguely worded, and it does seem that an awful lot of the power will rest with the police.
Well, you're right. It is down to subjective interpretation, personal evaluations by police, the Crown Prosecution Service staff, and judges to determine what constitutes hate. Because it is very difficult to define, and it's certainly not defined in this legislation. So it is open to potential abuse. But simply, making a point or expressing a criticism or disagreement, even if that's offensive, even if it shocks people, that is not a crime under this law because there is this freedom of speech protection.
Where is the balance in this? Is this now shifting towards, compared to the previous laws that were in force, is it shifting us towards a limitation of free speech or stronger protections against hate speech? I wonder where you see the balance lying.
Well, the legislation says that it's an offence to behave or communicate in a way that a reasonable person would consider threatening, abusive, or insulting, and either intended or likely to stir up hate against a person because of their disability, religion, age, sexuality, and so on. So it actually says that, even if you're merely likely to stir up hate, you can be committing an offence. You don't have to have actually committed that offence, but if you're likely to have said something or behaved in a way that is likely to stir up hate, that will be an offence. And that, I think, is a step way, way too far. Moreover, the legislation does penalise insulting language. Now, in the Westminster Parliament, some years ago, the insult clause of the 1986 Public Order Act was repealed because MPs decided that was too low a threshold. But insulting is now reinstated under this legislation. And I think that again, the bar to merely insult someone, that's too low a threshold for a criminal sanction.
Do you think governments have got any kind of grip on the extent of online abuse? And do you think this attempt by the Scottish Government will succeed in tackling it or make any inroads into tackling it?
Well, certainly this legislation is a reaction to the very toxic levels of hate that exist on social media in particular. Not exclusively on social media, but particularly on social media. So that's a positive, supportive, laudable thing. But the question is, it all boils down to interpretation. You know, who decides and where is the line where criticism spills over into hate, where robust comments spill over into hate? And that's really, it's very difficult to define. And any attempt to define it has always come up against these same different problems, that defining hate is difficult and people will define it in different ways. And that will mean that sometimes a police officer will decide that something constitutes hate and is illegal under this law. Other times they'll say, no, it doesn't. So it puts the police in a very difficult position, an unfair position.
Does this, as with the progress and earlier versions of hate crimes legislations that have existed in the UK, do we really need to wait and see until there are prosecutions actually led to how effective or how accurate this law is? You've acknowledged that there was a need to update it, given the prevalence of, online discourse and other developments since the last set of laws on this in the 1980s. Is this a development that we just need to wait and see if it works?
I think we will have to wait and see. And my concern is that it may be enforced well or badly. We just don't know. I think that, as I said, the intention of the legislation was entirely laudable, to protect people against hate and hate crime. That's a good thing. But how it's going to play out in practice, I think, is a big question mark. And as I said, I'm really fearful the police are going to be overwhelmed with malicious, vexatious complaints against particular people who are targeted by campaign groups, and that is going to put the police, in a completely swamping position where they just will not be able to cope with the volume, and the end result is going to be we just don't know what the end result is going to be. So that is the big concern.
We mentioned JK Rowling's criticism in our introduction to this discussion as well, and I wonder, is there a risk that the bigger issues that you've raised there around freedom of speech and getting the balance right between protection and freedom, is this being distracted by the fact that the Scottish Government has included transgender rights in this bill? Does it feed into the broader narrative around so-called culture wars that we've seen play out in other parts of the political world?
I think it's quite right that the legislation does protect transgender people, because they are victims of a lot of hate, a lot of prejudice, and they deserve protection, as do everybody else covered by the legislation. Elderly people, black and ethnic minorities, Jewish and Muslim people, lesbian and gay people, and so on. So trans is just one aspect of this legislation. They're not being singled out or given any privileged status. They're just being given the protection which they and everybody else deserves.
Peter Tatchell, thanks very much for joining us. Really good to get your thoughts on that. That's human rights campaigner Peter Tatchell. Now, today sees the start of the government's new childcare scheme, under which parents of 2-year-olds will be able to access 15 hours of funded childcare. The Prime Minister calls it the biggest ever expansion in childcare that could be worth up to £7,000 annually for some families. But there have been some practical issues with the implementation. Well, joining us now with more is Bloomberg's Tiwa Abebayo. Now, Tiwa, There should be, of course, a celebration for many parents, but there are some flies in the ointment, aren't there?
Yeah, it seems that there have been a number of issues with accessing the benefits for parents, and that seems to be the crux of the criticism that the government's receiving. It seems that there's issues around staffing, funding, and a lot of industry players particularly are upset about what they perceive to be a lack of consultation. So just on the staffing point, these are plans which will come into play for working parents of 2-year-olds. They'll be able to access 15 additional hours of free childcare. So you can imagine that's quite a number of families that are affected by this. And what a lot of these facilities are saying is that they simply lack the staff to deal with this, to facilitate those extra places. Now, the Tories have said that they are trying to offer incentives to get people to work in nurseries, in childcare facilities, to have a sort of influx of new help. They're trialling offering £1,000 sign-on bonus. But those plans do remain quite unclear. And it's something that the Labour Party actually have criticised the government for. They've called it a childcare pledge without a plan. They've also released a sort of what they're calling a dossier of childcare chaos, accusing the government of not having properly looked into the implementation of these plans. But certainly on the funding side as well, there are certain childcare facilities, particularly in London, that are saying that these plans will put them out of business. They simply don't have the money available to make it happen, and they haven't been told about the level of funding that they will receive. It's particularly perhaps disappointing for the government. Maybe it's a problem for them, because this was one of Hunt's flagship plans in his spring budget last year as part of the grand idea of getting people back to work, boosting productivity. So it's not off to the best start, you could say.
Tiwa, does Labour have an alternative plan? They're not happy with these ones in the same way that many in the industry aren't happy about it either.
Yeah, well, for what it's worth, we have heard the Shadow Minister, Nick Thomas-Symonds, saying that the Labour Party would endeavour to keep the expanded childcare hours in place. What they have been slightly less clear about is how they'd plan to do that. They have last October commissioned a report from the former Ofsted inspector, Sir David Bell, to really sort of review the state of early education in the country and childcare, and look into how this can be improved. It's definitely something that Labour have also recognised as potentially a vote winner. The UK has some of the highest childcare costs in the world. So Labour too have recognised it's an area that needs to be worked upon, but it's yet to be seen how they'll do that. It is also worth saying that there may be a broader sort of problem with infrastructure in this country. It's certainly something Nick Leach, who is the chief executive of the Early Years Alliance, has said, that there's essentially no point in making these pledges for further free childcare without actually improving that infrastructure.
Interesting, Tiwa, you were speaking to the Shadow Women and Equalities Minister, Annalise Dodds, recently about their plans to make investing more accessible to women. A separate but related issue. What did she have to say?
Oh, I thought it was really interesting, because she did say that getting women more financially literate, empowering them to make more of those financial decisions for themselves and their families, is going to be a crucial part of Labour's economic plan were they to get into government. And she mentioned that it's something that Rachel Reeves, the Shadow Chancellor, also shares a passion for, and will be kind of putting women at the centre of her Securonomics plan, as she discussed previously. So we'll wait to see what happens with that, but it's certainly something that Labour are paying particular attention to at the moment.
Well, let's take a listen to what Annalise Dodds told you.
I know that Rachel Reeves shares that analysis as well. You know, this isn't something that's a kind of nice little add-on to talk about occasionally. It's something that's right at the heart of unlocking that stronger economy that we need to see.
We heard Rachel Reeves recently in the Mayor's lecture talking about Securonomics as Labour's real pitch for the economy. Where does women investing fit into that specific idea, economic outlook?
So many women are constantly focused on the security of their family finances, which can often be an incredibly difficult juggling act. But making sure that they are then financially empowered to put their best foot forward, I think, is incredibly important.
That was Annalise Dodds speaking to me as part of a panel about getting more women into investing. And kind of improving that gap, that investing gap between men and women, which is quite prolific at the moment. It was interesting because we spoke about a number of topics on this panel, also about the pension investing gap, which was quite a pertinent topic that came up. And it's clear that Annalise and the rest of her Labour colleagues are very committed to ensuring that these problems are alleviated. We're yet to see that translated into policy, but it's certainly something that's being raised in the conversations that are being had as we lead into an election year.
Well, that was the Shadow Women and Equalities Minister, Annalise Dodds, there speaking with Bloomberg's Tiwa Abebayo. Tiwa, thank you very much for that. That's it from us for today. If you like the programme, don't forget to subscribe and give it 5 stars so other people can find it on Apple Podcasts, Spotify or wherever you listen.
This episode was produced by James Woolcock and our audio engineer was Sean Gostamachia. I'm Yuan Potts.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. We'll be back with more tomorrow. This is Bloomberg.
Bloomberg UK Politics. Listen weekdays at noon on DAB Digital Radio in London.